For those of you who are new here, just a quick introduction. Right. So, what today is all about is every single month we host two different challenges when it comes to the data sets within Power BI. And every single challenge has two different webinars. One of them is a workshop, one of them is a top five announcement and the feedback session. So today is the workshop. During the workshop, primarily what we focus on is going through the data set. We're going to talk about the data a little bit. We're going to talk about some things I want you to notice or to consider when working with the data set. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them. This is what the session is all about. If you have something, feel free to ask it. I'll try to cover as much as I can. If I'm unable to cover it right now, I'll be sure to follow it afterwards. Just send you an email and explain everything. But yeah, going through the data set, giving you some tips and tricks on how to handle certain things. Maybe also talk about certain visualizations that I think could be working very good for this data set. Uh, Showing you a couple of setups, couple of formatting options, couple of things that I've noticed from previous challenges that were a little bit more difficult or where I noticed a lot of mistakes being made. So there's going to be a bunch of different things that we're going to be talking about. But yeah, the one thing that I want to kind of encourage always in the workshop sessions is if you do have any questions, feel free to ask them. This is your one chance where you can easily do this and I can answer them straight away. You can also sign up for the one-on-one sessions. That's another opportunity that you have to discuss these things. But you know, the more the merrier, right? So use the time wisely. If you have something, ask into the chat. I'll try to cover it as well. If for whatever reason, everybody's different, right? If for whatever reason you don't want to ask your questions publicly, I don't know. You might be a little bit of kind of, I don't know, let's say, not afraid, but I forgot the word. Shy. That's the word that I was looking. If you're a little bit shy and just don't want to ask them publicly, we have an amazing team also that supports you on these challenges. So you can write to webinars@zoomcharts.com. You can send in your questions. We're going to try to answer them that way as well. So yeah, different ways, different approaches, and how you can go around it. What else? Let me quickly share the screen. There's a couple of things I want you to know or that I want to quickly cover. For those of you who have been participating in the challenges before, you know most of these things already. But for those of you who are new, I just want to remind a couple of things. So the first things first, remember that for the mini challenge itself, you have to sign up separately in our website. In our website, you go to challenges right here. You choose Onyx Data in this case, and you can sign up. Once you sign up, remember that the benefit of it is you can also sign up for the developer's license. So the developer's license is something that allows you to use all of our visuals without any cost associated with it in the particular challenges, right? Sure, they have some limitations when it comes to publishing to web and so forth, but for the purpose of the challenges, creating the reports and everything like that, you're good to go, so you don't have to worry about it. If you want to read more about the developer's license, under resources, there's a blog post. So if we go right here, you can scroll down a bit, free developer's license right here, open up the blog post, and just scroll through it, see what it really means, how to apply the theme and so forth, how to better work with them. Because, it is simple once you kind of know it and you do this every single day. But when you're new to things, you just want a little bit of a guidance, right? So this is something that helps you. The other thing, for those of you who are new to ZoomCharts in general and Power BI as well, one thing that I recommend is do not skip and just go through some of these blog posts, right? You don't have to read all of them. It's the same as you don't have to read every single news article that's out there, right? But what's relevant, if you, for example, haven't played around with the KPI cards within a donut charts, you can open up, learn about it, see what how we talk about it, what we emphasize on. The same now for the KPI cards. So you can take a look at these as well to take a closer look at it. Uh, the other visuals, conditional formatting, and so forth. So a bunch of different resources. What else? If you are new to challenge environment as such, one stop that I recommend is whenever you go to the challenge page is open up the brief section. Memorize this, right? Always. Make sure that you can participate in the mini challenge. But the main idea why I always take you here and why I always recommend to look here is because we have this brief section. The brief section kind of explains what the data set is all about, what you could try to look into. And the main idea here is it's not necessarily something you must cover in the data set. these are just some of the ideas that you can cover, right? Because the most difficult part about participating in these public challenges is if you don't have a set sort of target or goal that you have to achieve with the report itself, you don't know where to start with. You don't know what calculations you need to make. You don't know what visuals to use and so forth. So the brief kind of gives you a few ideas. Now, remember, this doesn't mean that these are the only things you can do. No, you can go and analyze a completely different approach, completely different sort of dimension where uh, any way you have to like to approach this, you can do this. The base data set that we provide is the base, but you can enhance it, you can minimize it if it's necessary, you can add additional dimensions if it's necessary, and so forth. So we only give you the base of it, right? But you can modify it to make it sort of a little bit nicer for the story that you're trying to tell. So those are the main things. What else? One-on-one sessions. Remember, you have this option to sign up for them. Top 5 announcement webinars. If you haven't signed up for it yet, do so. The main reason for this is if you're especially new, these are the sessions where we talk about the top 5 reports, where we give our feedback, where we talk about certain executions of visuals or cards or whatever it might be at that point, where we talk about what's good, what might have been done differently, what we kind of from our experience know what works, what doesn't, what are the new trends, and so forth. So these sessions are very valuable as well. But yeah, enough chit chat. I think we can go ahead and look at the dataset, right? So once you download the dataset itself, what you're going to get is a CSV file. And within that CSV file, if we add it right here, you can see there's a couple of different things. There's things like kennels, animal IDs, names, and so forth. So in Power Query, I've said this about a million times now, but my quick recommendation is always have column profile and column quality. Do you need them? Maybe, but it is something that I typically use to give a first sort of idea about the dataset. The column quality is the first primary sort of qualification that allows me to understand whether or not the columns are even necessary or are they empty. Like, for example, very quick overview, right? If you also switch from the first 1,000 rows to the entire dataset, this does require a bit of computing power, so it takes a little bit longer to qualify everything, but it allows me to see that, for example, kennel ID is fully filled, animal ID is good, animal name, we have 339 cells where there is no name, even though we also have some nulls and so forth. Okay. What else? Secondary color not always there. Sex is there. DOB empty. Okay. Date of birth we don't know for 12% of the entries, which from 52K, quite a lot. But you see kind of what I'm doing, right? I'm going through these columns and doing some primary analysis and trying to understand. Okay, the date is there. This is going to be there. This goes into that. Then okay, kind of giving myself an explanation of the data set. If I do not understand something, like for example, let's say intake subtype OTC, have no idea what it means. Remember, you have this amazing tool called Google, right? Animal shelters, just try intake type OTC. What could it mean? Right? I'm not a wizard. I don't always know everything as well. Nowadays, it's a little bit easier. We have ChatGPT, for example, that you can use for these things, because in this case, you don't have a definition file. So you have to kind of play around a bit more with the values and try to understand everything if you don't know something. So use all the resources that are available to you. Reason for intake, we can see that even though the values are valid, if we look at the values by the distribution, we can see that most of them are null. So this might be something that I maybe not take into account, or I'll see what I do about it. But this is the main idea. I just go through it and try to understand where, what. If there is something that you're not going to be using within your report, or you understand later on, I'm probably not going to be using this right now, get rid of it. You have the data set, which is 52,000 rows, right? It's not massive by any long shot, but if there's something that you do not need for the report, there's no reason to keep this information here. Like, for example, I know already that from what I made, the crossing part, I don't necessarily need. So this is something that I could remove. I just thought about one use case actually. Not ideal use case, but how I could use it. Same goes for jurisdiction, outcome types, and so forth. The one thing though that I highly recommend it is sometimes it's perfectly set up for you, but the column names right next to them, you typically have these data types. My recommendation is go see if it's properly qualified. And what I mean by this is try to avoid any cases where you have the so called ABC123, both of the options here. It typically means that there is some sort of a text value and a numerical value. So it's left in a general sort of approach. We can actually try it here. Let's say primary outcome. Can I just try to what's outcome alive? This is an integer. Yeah, so it could be also type general, for example. So these sort of things. But yeah, if there's something that you don't use, get rid of it. Sure, it might be used afterwards at some point. If I need it, I can bring it back. Because remember, everything, let's say, if I delete all of these, because I don't use them right now, for example, right? So I looked at it, I'm not going to be using them. Then I play around with the data set, create my sample reports, and I remember, I actually had this flag that whether on the, um, when the patient was kind of signed off, whether it was alive or dead, I had a flag for it. So I can go back to Power Query, I can see removed columns, and I can see which ones were removed. And I can just take away, for example, intake duration. I want to bring it back. You can just modify that. And you can get the column back. Worst case scenario, if you don't want to change the M code, well, you just simply remove that step. You get all the columns back, keep the duration, and now delete everything else. Right? There are multiple ways on how you can approach this. There's going to be more faster or more streamlined, let's say, approaches, or more complex but understandable to you approaches. There's no universal approach that always is going to be working or it's always going to be the best approach. Do whatever works for you. That is my typical recommendation. Sure, there are guidelines on what to do, what not to do, and so forth, but at the end of the day, if you got to the result and if you're still learning, might as well just try to fix it for now and then see how we can solve it as a core problem. Trust me, some of the things that I did when I started off with Power BI, definitely not recommended, but hey, it did the job. Actually, one of them is going to be something I'm going to talk about today as well. But yeah, quick qualification of the dataset. And I know that we had a quick question as well. I noticed when I was doing the introductions is need classification on the last 6 row columns. So probably these ones. So yeah, please need interpretation for the last 6 columns in the dataset. Is current month, outcome. Okay, so these are essentially flags that allow you to understand whether the condition was met or not. Was outcome alive? So this just basically means that when the animal was leaving the kennel, was it alive or dead? 1 means alive, 0 means dead. So a full outcome. Then you also have some additional flags. Like for example, outcome is alive. It kind of goes to here. Should be the same approach. So alive. This one is a little bit confusing to me. There's probably a valid reason for this, but for me it was a little bit confusing because I mean there should probably be only 2 outcomes, whether they're alive or not. But there's others. So there are some specific cases. And the outcome is current just means that the outcome that was defined it's when it was kind of written into the data set is the actual and nothing can changed. Is current month, that's just the flag whether or not this is the current month. Probably this one you don't necessarily need. I mean, you might use it, but most likely not. So if we go to the charts and the report itself, there's a couple of things that I did here. And I'm going to actually clear these as well and try to explain why I did all of them. So what I initially did, let me just take one more thing. Minimum zoom, set it to like 2. Do a completely fresh reload. There we go. So when I first started off creating, let's say, or even we can try to replicate this, right? I created the map visual. So for a map visual, you need a latitude and longitude. Now, once I add a latitude and longitude, you need some sort of a value, because otherwise the default value that you see here is the number of points that you see in that particular location. So for example, you can see that the total number of animals is 50.5k almost, but I don't really have that number anywhere here. That's because those accidents might happen in the same location for multiple animals. So there might multiple instances for same location. So in that case, what I can do is, without any DAX, wouldn't recommend it. You need to start learning DAX and writing measures. You could use animal ID as your unique identifier, and you can add the animal ID in the value and say the aggregation is going to be count distinct. So this just gives me at least an overall outcome. So that's one part that I could do. Alternatively, number of animals, the same basic calculation, distinct count for animal ID. Now, the reason why you don't want to use just count and you need distinct count is because there might be instances where the same animal might be in multiple accidents, which is actually one of the reasons why, for example, when you start to put this information into the graphs, you might have some inconsistencies sometimes, because the same animal might be counted twice because he has had multiple, for example, accidents over the time. So depending on what you're calculating, you should be thinking about also what data you're putting into the visual. Like in the map visual, I'm going to be going for just the total number of unique animals and accidents. So that's why number of animals is also the value that I'm putting into map visual. Since I'm currently working with just the map visual, right? Let's assume I don't have any of these yet. This is what I started with. So when I first started to look at it, the first thing that I don't like about the map visuals is if I have some outliers. Sure, they might be in the dataset. In real life world, I would have to think about how to deal with them, what to do with them, how to show them, and so forth. Remember, this is a challenge dataset. You can modify it, you can clean it, you can remove everything that's unnecessary and just work with sort of relatively clean data. So what I did is I started to think about what would be the best approach to kind of make sure I can focus on this area and disregard these instances. I could take them into account, but I just didn't want to do it. So there are a few ways on how you can approach this. One way is if you right click on a node, you can see that basically all three accidents are actually happening in exactly the same location. So when I right click on it, there's only one longitude and latitude. So I could add this longitude and latitude as an exclusion in the filters. Just make sure you don't do filters on visuals. You do this on either the page or the whole report, because otherwise it's just going to be a little bit weird. For the DOB, I noticed some blank column values. How do we work with that? So when you don't have a date of birth, there are two ways on how you can handle it. You can essentially always create some sort of a reference time. Let's say all animals that are identified are most likely just unknown. So you create a separate class for that. The reason why you would do this is you would allow the user then to maybe either a slicer or, yeah, probably a slicer with just the tile section. Let's say how it would look like would be something similar to this. I would use the flag value for it. Where we had the flag is, for example, outcome is alive. True, false, right? If you go to the formatting options, there's a style called tile and do something like this, right? It's now true, false, but what I would do is basically create two different values. You can also do this with bookmarks, whereas one of them is include all animals, for example, basically all animals, or exclude the ones without date of birth. Probably have a better name for it, but you get the idea, right? You allow them to say, hey, do I want to look at the whole data set, or do I want to specifically look at those that has this part of information? So that's what I would do. But yeah, for the longitude and latitude, you can always create a list of excluded locations. Like for example, here you can see that it's actually taking information from a broader area. So if you right click on it, you can switch between these listings basically and see all these geotag locations, which you can try to exclude then afterwards. Same goes here and so forth. If you get a little bit closer, you can see, okay, actually this cluster is taking this location. So what I usually do is I try to get to sort of a view that I would like to keep here. And I try to understand whether this is the view that I want to have here. If so, then it gives me a reference as to what points need to be eliminated. I also try to understand if there's any way on how I can format this. Like, for example, all the locations that are essentially happening here are in California instead of California, right? Okay, this one is in Arizona. But remember, I said that, for example, the column where it was. I lost it. Crossing. The crossing column is basically an address if you look at the data. See? So what I could theoretically do is filter on all pages, crossings, advanced filtering, contains, and then now I need to figure out how to, for example, qualify. And all those addresses typically have state in the name, which is something similar to this. Now you can see that all the data is here. I still got rid of some of them that I needed probably, so I need to double check, but this is just an idea, right, on how to filter the data a little bit more. Same goes for other things. Once I created the map and the view is kind of okay, like I'm not focusing on the formatting options or anything. I'm just looking at the data set to make sure that it's a little bit easier to work with. So on the map, okay, that seems to be okay. What if I create a timeline? So for the timeline, what I'm creating is based on the date of accident. I want to see the timeline, whether there's some pattern or anything happening over there. I look at it and I see, okay, there are some accidents that are being recorded in 2013, 14, one accident, two accidents in 16, a little bit more starting from 17. Okay, I could get rid of these, for example. Again, intake date, advanced filtering is on or after, and we can just say that, I don't know, let's say I want to focus only on the last 5 years, right? I'm going to go ahead and go to 2020, January 1st, apply filter. We cut off everything that was excess and just keep it like this. I mean, you can go and up until 2017 where we had a little bit more accidents being happening. So that's probably when the database was fully kind of launched. Because this data set is an actual data set. It's a live data set. I think we can probably maybe give you the link afterwards as well if you want to take a look at it. But this is not something that we generated randomly. This is actual data set. So yeah, define the timeline. Like what I wanted to do is I don't want to go too overboard. I think the last 5 years should be enough to kind of give me an understanding of what's happening there. Same goes for animal types, intake types, age groups, and so forth. So I just start to kind of look at the additional properties or dimensions. And what I'm trying to do is I want to make sure that I don't have too much data, right? I could be looking at a very long period of time, but at the same time, let's say accidents that happened like 7 years ago are most likely not that relevant. I want to understand the trends in the last years. Maybe some policies were introduced, maybe changes in the traffic flow or anything that could be there, right? So that's one of the things. Some KPIs, so forth. So for the map visual, I'm going to keep it here. For the map visual, there's actually one feature that I think this dataset works very well for, and that is that under node settings, there is this feature called aggregated node highlight, this toggle right here, which by default is off. So what this means is whenever you hover over a location, right now you can see that nothing gets kind of highlighted, only the data point itself. But if you enable it, what it's going to show you is the area from which the points are being gathered, which becomes a lot more interesting when you don't have just three circles. But if you go closer to the city, you can see, for example, from which regions and where the sort of actual accidents are being grabbed from. So it's one thing that I think could be very beneficial in this case because it also allows the user to understand if I click this, what is the area that it's actually taking from. You can play around with this area, of course, with the node cluster distance. I would recommend to increase it because if you're going to have it very low, let's say, I don't know, 30 maybe, you can see it's just there's a little bit too many data points. And especially if you have bigger and smaller ones, they're starting to overlap. Sure, I could enable some outline, for example, to kind of try to see where things are overlapping or creating these sort of bubble effects. But I could play around with the fill colors, so maybe something like 30% to kind of create a heat map of areas and so forth. But I don't know. I don't think it kind of works very well for this case. So what I would do is increase the distance, make fewer bubbles, and enable the node highlight so I can see the areas where things are being grabbed from, and allow the user just to kind of explore the map itself. The setting is something that you have to play around with, definitely. You don't want to make it too high. For example, let's say 99, where the areas are very big and very hard to kind of see where it splits down. And when you go out, it just is one single dot, basically, right? It's not ideal. So you want to have some categories and splits being visible. Because you can see the accidents itself are physical locations, they're not just randomized. So this is one part of it. For the timeline, I limited the data view. And the other thing that I would probably play around with is the display periods and units. Like, for example, display periods by default, you have all of them enabled, which means that if you click on this drop down, you do have a lot of options, but most likely you're not going to be needing all of them. Plus, I'm not a fan of any cases where there is additional scroll bars or anything. I think everything should kind of fit nice and neatly within the view. So if you go into the formatting options, display periods, you can disable all. These toggles are here just to kind of help you out with disabling or enabling all of them. I can click disable R, so it clears it, and I can say I want to focus on. Let's actually see how close to the actual date we captured it. The last data refresh is in October. And what date? 26th. So taking this week, probably not useful. So what I would probably stick to this not this month also, because we're going to be going over it. I'm going to take last month, last year, last quarter. Last week would be beneficial if we would have live data set, but this is already a little bit outdated. But what this allows me to do is, okay, I have 3 of them. Maybe I'll just leave last month and last quarter. So something like this, right? Which allows me to very quickly just kind of reshift the focus on the timeline to focus on a particular time frame. I can still zoom out, for example. I can still start to investigate it separately, but this is just like a mini bookmark within a visual itself. And the same goes for the display units. If you're not going to be using some of them, even though you have them in the hierarchy, you can go into the formatting options right here and disable some of them. So let's say the quarterly view isn't really something I'm going to be looking at, maybe. So I'm going to be focusing on year, month, day. So what that means is if I click on a year, I'm going to go straight to months. And if I'm going to click on a month, I go to days. I don't have to click on them. I can also use the drop down to quickly switch around different time periods and different viewports, basically. So depends on how much data you have within it. From a toolbar perspective, this is one thing that I want to highly kind of remind everybody. There's different items in the toolbar. For example, we do have back button, zoom out, linear and logarithmic scales, display periods, units, reset button, and so forth. If you're not using any of these, please get rid of them. The one thing that I can ensure you that like 80% of you or 90% of you are never going to be even using it is linear and logarithmic scale. So if you're not using this item, this is right here, just get rid of it. There's no reason to have an item that doesn't provide me with some additional context, right? Everything that the user is not using, get rid of it. Sometimes, if the chart is very simple in an essence, what I do is I sometimes leave the zoom out button to kind of allow them to move around. But if they're familiar with how the charts work, I get rid of these. I keep the unit and period because it allows them to quickly kind of manipulate the view. And I always enable the reset button. The main reason why I want to do this is because whenever a chart is sending out a filter, you can see the reset button appears. And this doesn't require any additional bookmarks. The bookmark is necessary to create something that allows me to clear everything, but the chart reset allows me to clear that particular chart. So I would just, if I have multiple charts, I would go into the toolbar and enable it for all of them. If I'm not using these items, again, get rid of both of them. And whenever a user clicks, for example, on a category, you can see there's a reset here, there's a reset here. And what it basically allows me to do is I can clear one visual without touching the other one. So it gives you a little bit more flexible approach on how to filter, cross-filter the information across different visuals and how to basically tell the story with the data. So that's one thing. Drill down levels, make sure that they make sense. What else? The way I would probably look at this data set is I would go with two different approaches. One is, I forgot to close a couple of things. There we go. Life is life, right? Notifications happen. So what I would do is I would keep one view, which is more of a broad overview of how the situation is just overall looking, how many accidents we have, how many we have had in the last month or last week, is it an increase from the previous period, and so forth. Allow some basic filtering and so forth. And then the other one would be a more detailed report, whether it would be for a kennel, because that's one of the properties that we have here, or maybe by animal type, by injury type, by the call out type, by the jurisdiction. Like, we do have different views that you can create from the available data, right? You can try to always create one page which kind of answers a lot of different questions. But remember, a good report page is always answering one primary question and maybe a few secondaries, but not too many. If it answers every single question, it's most likely overcrowded with dimensions and views that you're kind of trying to develop in a single view. You want to make sure that you can find the answer to the main question very easily. That's usually the main KPI. Some additional conditional formatting or anything that allows me to provide context, so whether it's good or bad. So let's say if I filter out, let's say last month, we have had 218 incidents that have been registered. Okay, in comparison to the last week, right? I want to understand whether this number is increasing or decreasing. Increasing or decreasing, that's also an arrow that I can put into a card, for example. Okay, that gives me some context, some additional context. What is the average number of incidents within a month? That also gives me a reference point, right? So, for example, if I take the last year into account, I calculate the average, and I can also create some, for example, sort of benchmarks, right? You don't have it in this data set, but remember, you can do some modifications if it's necessary. You can sort of create tiers. You can create lower tier, which is what's acceptable, which part is starting to become worrisome, and which part means that something is happening, whether, I don't know, the traffic incidents itself are increasing, the traffic within the city is increasing because it's the holiday season. So, I start to look for different other information patterns. But that's one of the parts. The reason why I wanted to put the kennel ID is because this is something that I noticed a lot in a lot of challenges as well, where whether you didn't know how to do this or just didn't pay attention to it. So, kennel ID, by default, if you look at the value, is a numerical value, right? So what Power BI is going to do by default is it's going to say, hey, it's a whole number. I mean, it is, right? You can't argue with it. It's an identification number, so it's a whole number. There's no decimals in this case. So whenever you try to, for example, create a slicer, and if you add kennel ID, it's going to consider it to basically be a boundary between this and that. Okay, not really what I wanted to switch to, let's say, a drop down. Cool. This is kind of closer to what I wanted to have. I wanted to be able to look for a specific kennel. But if you are using numerical values, you are not able to enable searching. So a workaround for this is you can take the same column. You can always create a new calculated column if you already are using the number somewhere else. But what I did in this case is I just changed the data type from a whole number to a text, because the look and feel for the end user is going to be exactly the same. But what it allows me to do is now, because it's a text, I can enable search. So if I have something specific that I want to look for, let's say 600 something maybe. 5, 2, 1. There we go. just as an example, right? I don't necessarily know which ones are higher or lower. So something like this that allows me to quickly find a particular kennel. A full list of these is interesting, but what I think would be also very beneficial in these cases is if you are looking for a view as sort of a kennel overview, maybe give a quick insight, whether it's in the tooltip, whether it's a small chart somewhere that allows me to understand which kennels are the primary incident intakers. So just to kind of give you a very basic idea, right? I take number of animals, kennel ID. Those are distinct numbers, and then I number it back and forth, so it always counts a distinct number there. Okay, kennel ID. What if I take the animal ID and distinct count and just a count? Have to look at the data. But this allows me to, for example, also sort them in a way where it's just not a single entry. If it is just a single entry for every single one of them, well, then I might need to check if maybe there's something in the dataset that I can adjust. But the main idea is just looking at how to approach this. I saw we had a question for a second when I started to blabber on. How resource can be utilized by animal shelters, and based on that, how animal welfare can be improved by them? That's a good question. I would probably have to ask this to the Long Beach animal shelters, because they're the ones that are creating this data set. But the way I would at least take this data set into account is based on the data timeline itself. I would first try to see if there is any seasonality. So for example, let's say if I turn on quarters back on, and instead of looking at 5 years, I'm going to be looking at maybe the last 3 years, just to kind of have a little bit less data. So starting from 2022, so almost 4 years of data. Split the quarters, see if there's any patterns. So my main concern would be, why is there a sudden increase again in incidents when it was dipping down in the previous 2 years? What has changed, right? Maybe it's just because the system became more popular and suddenly people are registering these incidents a lot more. Or, I understand why is there discrepancy in the data. That's one part of it. The other part is if I look at, for example, like the last 2 years and I switch to a monthly view, I want to see if there's any additional patterns that I can unlock. So, for example, I don't know, maybe if within a year view, if there's any seasonality. That's another thing that I would be looking into. That's one part of it. Once I have the seasonality, I also want to understand if there's any particular animal types that are most highly, for example. This is one thing that I kind of found interesting, right? If you look at the incidents most of the incidents are happening to cats. If we based on the intake type, if we take, for example, strays, those are still cats. But if you look at other incident types, let's say owner surrenders, in this case it's the same. I was finding something more interesting when I was playing around with the dataset. Let's see, what have I filtered out that changes it? 2020, I think it was. Maybe this one? Yeah, see? For example, now the pattern changes. So there's a lot more stray cats that have been reported for having incidents. The cats and dogs are the highest ones. Just makes sense, right? But at the same time, what it allows me to understand is that most of these cats are ownerless, right? Whereas own pets who have owners, so owner surrendered pets, there's a lot more dogs being given up back to shelters. What happens to the seized ones? Again, most of the cases where animal or a dog specifically is being involved, it's because the owner is either giving it back or it's being basically taken away from him. So that's one part of things that I could take into account for animal shelters when, for example, looking through adoption papers. Maybe there's additional check that we need to make. Maybe there's an additional pattern that we're trying to look for. So that's one way in how I would look at it. The other thing is just based on regions on the map, look at certain hotspots. Maybe in certain areas we need to run a little campaign, kind of talking about safety on the roads, talking about safety with animals on streets and so forth. Because in some cases it's very sort of, small numbers, so it's understandable, things happen. But if there's a very high density, the main question is why is it happening, right? Is there any specific crossings? What time of day? If we have, we actually have it, I think. If you look at the intake, no, we only have the date. But if you would also have the time, maybe it's the time of the day. Maybe it's a very not well lit area or street or crossing or whatever it is, right? So based on that, you start to do additional investigations. Uh, Age is something that I calculated as well dynamically. So we have date of birth. So DOB is date of birth. So age, I just went with date diff. I went with starting date of birth up until today in years. And if I would just have age as a column, we can still keep it, right? We can kind of have I'm going to make it bigger so it's easier to see. We can kind of see the overall situation. We have a lot of different animals that are currently unqualified because we don't know the date of birth, which is one of the things that I mentioned, right? Do we include them in the data or do we exclude them? Because there are certain analysis that you can do based on age, and you can do it if it's undefined. So for that part of analysis, I would just probably, again, on all pages, there's an outlier -6 as well in some place. So that's an issue with the data. So I would get rid of that and get rid of blanks. The rest of them, I can have it. So this looks a little bit better. Sorting. Take a look at the age, because you probably also want to see the distribution like this rather than the highest numbers. Because remember, when you're looking at the x-axis, you want to understand the flow of information. When it's categorical, it's a little bit more difficult because then you most likely are looking at the values. But when we are talking about things that are continuous, things like age, timelines, dates, anything that sort of type of data, you want to have a hierarchical sort of flow for the information because that's how our brain perceives it a lot better. So this allows me to understand which area or which age groups are essentially the high risk ones, where it starts to go up and down. I mean, animals with 32 years of age, just kudos to them for even getting that far. But hey, so this is one of them. Uh, the other thing that I would do when I looked at it, and this is what I started to do, is some of these, basically over 10, you can see are starting to dip down. And if I don't have that much space, because I could theoretically leave this, but I think all of us can agree that it's very narrow, it's very kind of squeezed together. So one thing that you can do is you can create groups. And for the groups, you can play around with the values. I created a separate table for that just for the sorting purposes. So what I did is I created the groups, everything that's below 1 year, up until 10, and then 10 plus. In the same manner, you can also create different age groups. There's different ways on how you can handle this. The most simple one is on the age column, right click, new group. Bins, I wouldn't necessarily recommend here. I don't think it's going to work. Maybe based on the size of bins, maybe that's maybe like 5 year bins or something like that. But alternatively, you have the list where you have manually can define which age belongs to which group. So that's what I did. I created these groups. So in my case, if I added groups, I basically did where starting from 1 to 10, everything is in a separate group. You can see there's only one value. I know it looks weird, but this is just one way on how to do it. You can also do this just by DAX. So 0 to 10, I created separate groups, and then under 10 plus, I just added everything else. The problem with this, though, is that if I use the age groups that I just created, and if I try to sort by, even ascending, right? You can see that there's one issue. 0, 1, 10, 10 plus. Why is it happening? Because a list is a textual value. So you cannot sort it based on numerical numbers. Usually what I hear here afterwards is, hey, but you can just take a group and sort it by age. You can't, because some of these groups have multiple ages underneath. So based on which age am I supposed to sort it, right? The first, the last, the average, which one? I don't know, so you can't do it. So a workaround that I've found for this when I started to work with Power BI, there's different ways to do it. Trust me. There's ones where you can just stick with DAX and do everything very simply. This is the longer way how I did this, but it works. I do it like this sometimes when I need a sort of a sorting table very quickly. I create a new table. I can keep the name whatever it is, because I'm going to delete it afterwards. And what I do is I create a new table, which is just the list of all the distinct values. So if I go to a table view, you can see this is the list, table 2, of all the distinct values that I have. I take it, I copy the table. Now I go to enter data, I put it in, I create a new column which is order, and I say then, you can probably see where this is going, right? This is going to be 10, 11, 12, 13. So you get your age, you get your groups, load it in. This is definitely not the dynamic approach, but it is a way. Table 2, which was my list of unique values, I could delete afterwards. But what I need to do now is I'm going to remove this connection. The table 2, which I just created, I'm going to delete also this. So imagine I don't have any of these. Hide. For now, they can sit here. So I connect the age groups, because you need to have a relationship between them, because you're going to be using it within a visual afterwards. You take the age groups and you change the sort order. Now what this allows me to do now is get rid of age groups in the visual, add the age groups from the newly created table, make sure you check the sorting, so based on age groups, based on ascending, and now everything is sitting where it's supposed to be. So different things that you can apply to. I think also a scatter plot could be a nice fit for this. So for example, you can calculate the average animal age. Again, you're excluding in this case everything that is blank or -6, which were those outliers, because you can't have an average age in consideration with with animals that don't have an age right now, right? So you need to get rid of them somehow, and then just play around with, for example, intake types, subtypes, and so forth. Maybe combine them with so you have more variation. I mean, you can try to also go a little bit overboard and just put on animal ID as the category. But what it's going to do is just create a lot of data points, which most of them are even sitting at. Oh, yeah, it's because we're going to be in a specific group. Yeah, there's 251 ID here, 300 there. So maybe something a little bit higher. Kennel ID could be one of them where we take a look at. Jurisdiction, see if there's any outliers. There's definitely is one. For that one, we can start to investigate again based on animal type and so forth. We could create conditional columns for age groups and Power Query. Yeah, you can do that as well. You can do it in Power Query. You can do it through DAX. You can do it like I just did right here. There's different ways on how you can approach the same thing, right? The main idea is just to kind of play around with these ideas. If you can do it in Power Query, usually recommend it because then it's a little bit easier on the computing power. But you know, it's not always an option. Sometimes you have to work with limited resources. So that would be one of them as well. Uh, do we have any other questions, Alexandra? What are some actual problems this dataset can solve in real world cases? Uh, like I mentioned, one of them is understanding which regions of the city have higher prompt of having incidents involving animals. Maybe these regions need some additional security measures. Maybe theirs needs some additional training. Whatever it is for the owners. If not, maybe these areas need additional, for example, not animal shelters, but animal control patrols, basically. Because if most of the incidents are happening to strays, if we filter it out, look at the map again, yeah, these two, basically this area of the city. Maybe it's something we need to investigate further. No, I'm just playing around, trying to see if there's anything happening in the airport. Luckily, no. Around it, yeah. In the airport, no. But yeah, this is one of them. Understanding the patterns of maybe specific animal types. If it is so, trying to understand if there's something we can do about it, the timeline, if there's seasonality, any additional patterns, the age groups, and so forth. Anything else? Nothing more. Okay. Uh, yeah. From my side, what else? Like I said, a timeline I think could be a good fit. The map visual definitely can be utilized for this one. Combos, maybe donut charts. For the combos, one thing that I would recommend is see how much data you have within a category. Like, for example, if you don't have a lot of space for the visual, let's say this is the maximum I can use for this visual, right? I can't make it any more wider or longer. So I could try to play around with y-axis, this property right here, max unit height or initial unit height, to kind of define where I'm starting from. Let's say if I put it at 10, you can see it seems like I'm taking everything in. Whereas if this uses default, it kind of makes sure that I can read all the labels and everything properly and there's no overlap. But at the same time, again, if these are very small portions of it, maybe I just want to focus on cats and dogs. If it's just cats and dogs, let's say animal type, cat, dog, there's only two of them. Suddenly, maybe a bar chart is not needed, so I can switch it out to be a donut chart. Go underneath it. This could be one approach that I can take from it. Play around with additional properties and so forth. Also, probably not for this challenge, but for the one that we're going to be hosting in January, I can tell you right now, the donut chart is going to have a lot more customization when it comes to detail labels. Just to kind of give you an idea, let me get the app source version quickly, and they're going to be able to wrap up things. Um, so I'm going to take this one. So in the app source version, detail labels are currently like this, right? You're controlling all of them simultaneously. So if you change a font or a color or something, it changes to all the elements that are within the detail label. Starting from next release, this is something that we're going to be bringing eventually to all the charts, but we're starting with the donut chart. If we open up detail labels, you can see that now every single part of the label, which is the category, the value, or the percentage, are separate toggles. And for each of them, you have multiple additional properties that you can define. You can also create additional backgrounds that take the color, inherit basically the color from the original part. You can adjust the transparencies. If you have multiple of them, let's say even if I have all of them, you can even define things like which one is where. So for example, into multiple lines, and I can say that instead of category or being, let's say, percentage being at the bottom, I want the percentage to be the second part and the category value to be at the bottom. So you're going to have a lot more flexibility when it comes to this. And one interesting thing that we added is if we try to compare it to something else, it's not going to be a great example right now, but if I use a reference value, you can see there's going to be an option to quickly highlight whether this value is higher than the reference value or lower. So that's a fourth item that we're adding there as well. So a lot more flexibility and customization is going to be coming to that part as well. So looking forward to that. All right. But yeah, from my side, I hope it was interesting. I hope you managed to learn something new. Most importantly, I hope it was just a useful webinar, because if not, what am I doing here? Um, but to let us know how it went, you do have your QR codes now on the screen. So if you scan it, if you fill in the form, it allows us to understand how we're doing with these webinars. Whether you like them, you dislike them, if you're feeling that you're missing something, some part of information never gets covered, do let us know about it. Because if you tell us, it's something that we can fix. If you don't tell us about these things, well, general assumption is either everything is good or everything is bad, right? Or somewhere in between. But I want to understand how we can improve as well. So your feedback is very valuable. All right. Thank you so much for your attention and time. And I'll see you in the top 5 announcement. Bye, everyone.